And last, but certainly not least among our fMRI practices to avoid, is the issue of informal reverse inference. There's a way of doing formal reverse inference that's valid, and we'll talk about that. So reverse inference is a form of mind reading, essentially. Basically, what you're trying to say is, can we infer a cognitive or affective process based on patterns of activation? So, for instance, if you see a statement like, there's activation in Broca's area, and that indicates that participants were using some sort of verbal or language-based approach to doing this experiment. So what the authors are doing in that case is they're inferring the cognitive state of the participants based on the fact that they've seen activation in this part of the brain. That is an informal example of reverse inference, and it happens all the time. So the way you can sort of formalize this is, in this study, whenever you're doing some task comparison, A, brain area Z was active. So looking at brain area Z, what we say is, anytime we've seen that in other studies, we see that cognitive process X was engaged. That was the way the study went. And that means that whenever we see Z is active in our study, we can assume that people are thinking X. So that was quite the abstract way of doing it. But the Broca's area example is a perfect case. That is to say, whenever we've seen studies that show Broca's area activation, we see that those are language studies, and therefore, when I see activation in Broca's area, I can assume that people are doing some sort of language processing, even if that's not what I thought they'd be doing for my experiment. And look, there's some really, really egregious examples of this, one of which comes from neuromarketing, everybody's favorite whipping boy. So I thought it would be worth sort of explaining this. There's a guy named Martin Lindstrom, who's a brand guru, whatever the heck that is. And Martin did this study with Apple many, many years ago when iPhone came out. And people were spending an inordinate amount of time on their iPhone. And Martin had this idea that people were becoming addicted to their iPhones. And the cool thing about that is that he thought this is something we could actually test with neuroscience, because we know something about the nature of addiction in the brain. So for instance, the images here show abnormalities in a part of the brain called the ventral striatum that show up in different types of addiction. And I can't remember exactly which color is which, but there are three types of addiction here. There's nicotine addiction, alcohol addiction, and addiction to cocaine, all of which essentially co-localize within this ventral striatum. Ventral striatum is part of your brain's reward network. It's where dopaminergic neurons project up to prefrontal cortex and send reward signals. So there's abnormal brain structure and function in areas of the brain associated with reward. If that's the case with these crazy addicted iPhone users, we should see the same thing. We can put people who are spending crazy amounts of time with their iPhone into a scanner, show them pictures of iPhones, play sort of Apple-based sounds, and we should see abnormal patterns of activation in this part of their brain relative to a group of people who are not spending inordinate amounts of time with their iPhone. So it was a hypothesis-driven experiment that had a basis in the existing literature, and that was all well and good. The problem is that's not at all what he found. The results of his study didn't show anything different in the ventral striatum. Instead, what they showed was activation in the insula bilaterally. And this is where the problem came. So Lindstrom and his colleagues looked at this and said, well, wait a second. What do we know about activation in the insula? This is the clue that we're starting the reverse inference process. And what he said was, what's interesting about the insula is that that's something associated with love. He found a couple of studies where insula activation was associated with romantic love. So it's not that you're addicted to your iPhone, it's that you love your iPhone. Different scenario, but still great news for Lindstrom and for Apple. Now, imagine you're Apple, and you're then going to put together some sort of big old marketing campaign around this. You would like these interpretation to be valid and correct, because otherwise you're going to put together some multi-million-pound campaign that's not really going to land in its market. The problem is that Lindstrom published this in a letter to the New York Times. Approximately 2 weeks later, Russ Poldrack led a group of international neuroscientists who wrote a response to this saying, hold a sec. And in fact, Russ wrote a blog post called New York Times op-ed plus fMRI equals complete crap. which I highly recommend you read. But the key here is that Russ is pointing out that this is a classic example of reverse inference. He's looking at activation in the insula and saying, well, what do we know about those areas? And then inferring cognitive state. How accurate is that? And the answer in this case is not at all. So it's not clear to me how Lindstrom decided that the papers to look at were the two that showed romantic love, because the vast majority of fMRI papers that show activation in the insula don't show anything to do with romantic love. In fact, it's often associated with proprioception, breathing, pain threshold, disgust, but love, not so much. And in fact, the really, really good sort of gold standard love papers don't show activation in the insula. And this is the problem. The problem is that it's very easy to have a very blinkered self-selection bias when you're looking at papers. You sort of look at the things that you know about, or the things that fit your hypothesis, or the things that you're interested in, and you ignore all the rest of the literature. That's informal reverse inference, and that's why it's a very dangerous thing to do. Because, of course, you're missing most of the relevant information by doing that, and you're not even aware of it under normal circumstances. So, as I said, this is just sort of a summary of things that we know about the insula, which is that area shown in green if you open up the Sylvan Fisher. And one of the things that we find is that insula activation is reported in nearly a third of all fMRI studies. It's incredibly common. So there's no way you would reasonably be familiar with, on the order of 10 to 20,000 fMRI studies in sufficient detail. So of course you're going to get sort of bias in terms of doing this kind of informal reverse inference. But if you do start to look across some of those studies, as I say, you get things like pain, you get hatred and disgust, interoceptive awareness, that is to say sensitivity to your own internal body state, etc. So there are lots of things that are going on. Love isn't really a significant contributor in this, which means that if Apple were going to put together a campaign based on this, they'd have thrown good money after bad and simply, befuddled their audience who was thinking, yeah, that's all well and good, but I don't know about you, I don't love my iPhone, okay? It's useful, I'm spending a lot of time with it, it's helpful, whatever. There's no way that I am in love with my iPhone. So there is a correct formal way to do reverse inference. And that is that you can use sort of Bayes' theorem. And again, in keeping with my policy of not having a whole lot of equations, I've included this one. For those of you who have seen Bayes' theorem before, that's excellent, and you can work your way through it. But there is a formula that allows you to calculate the probability that this cognitive state is associated with this particular type of activation. And this is the formula. And what this is telling you is that the probability that you're in this cognitive state X, given activation in brain region Z, is equal to, and then the rest of this equation, right? So I'm not going to sling you through it. You can take your time and go through it if you want. But what I want to do is instead give you an example. So the problem here is that you need to estimate some of these probabilities, and you need to do it more formally than, hey, these are a couple papers I've seen, and so, oh yeah, whenever you see activation in Broca's area, of course it's a language task. I'm a language neuroscientist. I've seen a lot of language studies, and a lot of them have activation in Broca's area. So that's plausible to me, but what I don't know is all the studies that aren't language that have shown activation in Broca's area. And I can't, off the top of my head, tell you what percentage of the language studies I've looked at that don't show activation in Broca's area. Those two numbers, however, are essential to doing this correct. So what you can do is use something like an existing database of studies. So what Ross Poldrack did in this classic paper was he used the Broca's language example and went to one of the existing fMRI study databases and characterized all the studies in there, of which there were 3,000 or something like that, into language and not language studies. And he then counted all the ones that showed activation in Broca's area versus all the ones that didn't. And he put it in a little table like you can see here on the screen. With that information that comes from this unbiased sample of the existing literature, these 3,000 studies, you can then use that Bayes equation to figure out what the probability is that somebody's engaged in a language task given that there's activation in Broca's area. So I leave that as a task for you to plug those numbers into the equations that I gave you on the previous slide. What you find out is that the probability is 46%, just slightly under half, based on this, this formal way of doing it. And that's fine. This is a correct, valid way of doing reverse inference, because what it gives you is this unbiased probability that your inference is legitimate. And if you're happy with the idea that it's probably legitimate 46% of the time, great. But you now know the certainty that you can appreciate this particular inference with. It's not what you may have assumed informally, that of course the two are linked, and therefore I could reasonably say, yeah, if I see Broca's area activation, it probably means somebody's engaged in a language task. I bet that's really high. Well, I bet that's really high probably does not equate to 46%. Okay, so the take-home messages from this final week of the module are as follows. One, we have to use corrected statistical thresholds when we're reporting our results. When we're looking at our results, when we're trying to understand them, go ahead, use as lenient statistical threshold as you want. But when you're reporting your results, when you want people to think that this is legitimate and that you've done everything that needs to be done, they have to be corrected for multiple statistical comparisons so that what we're looking at is meaningful. Otherwise, you're in a dead salmon situation. Be very, very careful about actually testing for differences if the differences are what you're interested in. It's not sufficient to say this condition is significant and this condition isn't, therefore there's a difference. That's a thresholding fallacy, and it's very easy to get away from that, get around it, and do it correctly by using a paired t-test to test it, or looking for the relevant interaction term that indicates that statistically these two conditions are not the same. If you're going to do correlations with regions of interest in your fMRI, be very, very careful about circularity, right? It's very easy to do that if you haven't used some sort of a priori definition for your region of interest that does not rely on the existing data set. That's the key. And it's not just that it doesn't rely, but that it isn't linked to it at all. So it's not the case that you can sort of look in your data, see where there's activation, and then go look in the literature for areas to define your region of interest in. That is also linked, because now the data that you've looked at, your experiment, has influenced the way you're defining your ROI. They have to be independent. And if they're not, then you're going to artificially inflate effect sizes, correlations, etc. You're engaging in voodoo correlations. And then finally, there's just no excuse really ever for informal reverse inference. If you think it's important to infer what the cognitive state is based on some degree of activation, then fine. There are tools for doing that formally. You need to use Bayes' theorem. You need to use some sort of existing sample of the literature that allows you to quantify the times that these you see these activations or don't in this kind of cognitive state or not. But if you don't have that, don't make assumptions about the cognitive state of the that's there as a result of your activations. All four of these are ridiculously common in the literature, and I'm no stranger to this. I've made many of these errors myself in the course of my career. So I'm not trying to be, high and mighty and preach here. All I'm saying is these are things that are well understood. I'm presenting them to you so that you're more likely to recognize them both in other people's papers, but also in any work that you do yourself. Because the reality is sometimes you kind of get caught up in your experiment and then you do something and then you step back and think, oh, wait a second, that's that thresholding fallacy. I need to actually include a test to make sure that those two things are different. I hope this is very helpful to you, and I hope that in general this module has been sufficiently informative to get you started on your fMRI journey. Thanks very much for your time.